These are in listen-only mode.
Greetings and welcome to today's DCMI ACES joint webinar with Stephanie Lemieux, titled Creating Content Intelligence, Harmonize Taxonomy and Metadata in the Enterprise Context. My name's Stuart Sutton, and I serve as Managing Director of the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's joint DCMI ACES webinar and our presenter. I'll also moderate the questions and answers at the close of the webinar. The webinar is being recorded and is scheduled for 1 hour and 15 minutes, although we may end earlier than that. Today's webinar with Stephanie Lemieux will focus on the context of the enterprise and will describe the benefits and challenges in developing metadata and taxonomy across multiple functional areas to create unified enterprise content architecture. Stephanie will illustrate her presentation using real enterprise metadata and taxonomy harmonization projects. Stephanie Lemieux is president and primary consultant at DevCot Studio in Montreal, Canada. So, welcome, Stephanie, and I turn the webinar over to you.
Thank you so much, Stuart. All right, well, welcome to everyone. I hope you're excited to be talking about metadata this early in the morning. I know I am. Stuart introduced me a little bit, but just to give you a little bit more background, I specialize in taxonomy, metadata, and all things organizing content. I do a lot of work with different organizations around taxonomy in different tools such as content management, digital asset management, a lot of SharePoint, probably more than I'd like. And I do all of this with my fancy library degree from McGill. So one of the things I'd like to say before starting out is that this might be a little bit different from some of the other presentations that you might be used to from DCMI and ACES. To be clear, I'm not a researcher. I come very squarely from the world of business consulting. So I deal with lots of different kinds of organizations, both big and small, who are in varying states of disorder when it comes to managing content and data. So I'm not going to talk about any specific technology research or experimental approaches or anything like that. You're going to hear from me very practical problems that folks in the enterprise are trying to solve down in the trenches of mass content creation. So I spend a lot of time in my work trying to get marketers and managers to understand why metadata and structure is so important. And it's hard because, as you know, most people have a hard time caring about standards and data structure. Go figure. But the same is true also the other way around, because the IT and data side of the house often doesn't really care about the content. What their so lovingly crafted data often gets applied to. They really hate fluffy things, ambiguity, and so there's like this Chinese wall between the two groups sometimes. So part of what I do in my consulting work is try to bring these two worlds together to start working more often together on these kinds of projects. So with that perspective in mind, let's jump in. One of the biggest things I hear about at work right now is big data, and I'm sure you do too. It's the big buzzword at all the conferences and all the trade pubs. You know, with such copious amounts of data to manage, how will we ever glean useful insight from it? How can we make sense of the mess of information? OMG. Well, you know, we've been having that same problem over on the content side of the house for much longer. We hit that panic button a really long time ago. As soon as we had more than 1,000 of anything, we freaked out. Such copious amounts of content, how will we ever glean useful insight? How can we make sense of this mess? So on and so forth. So the too much stuff issue is, you know, it's so common that it's basically cliche at this point. But the idea here is that once you hit a certain amount of content growth, you start outpacing whatever structure you have set up to support it. So even if you did start out with some metadata, maybe a little bit of taxonomy, you turn your back for a minute, and then you can't get in the front door anymore. So what happens is we build lots of systems to try to solve the content problem, and we throw other repositories at it. So the first one's a good idea. But then when it gets not too well organized or people don't like it, you know, someone says, oh, great, well, let's get Documentum or let's get SharePoint. But then, of course, there isn't only one SharePoint. There's 3 instances of SharePoint, and then 2 other departments are spinning up their own pilots of things, and none of them are on the same upgrade path. And then some tools are really content specific, like the legal library or the digital asset management system, and some of them have overlaps, like maybe there's a marketing library that kind of has some digital assets in it. And then some things are completely disconnected from the whole network. So basically what happens is we just keep up spooling more systems. We don't put enough effort into architecting it. We don't understand the whole landscape. And so it gets crowded and messy, and people give up and move to the next thing, etc. So ultimately, though, in an enterprise, we're all kind of talking about the same things. We're all in the same organization. But for some reason, because it's just content, quote unquote, business owners are left to basically run amok and architect things however it makes sense for them a lot of the time. There are rarely any metadata standards and not a lot of thought put into interoperability. And again, this is from lots of different projects that I see with lots of different sizes of organizations. Of course, some organizations have really got their act together and they have very strict governance standards across all IT systems, but very often that is not the case. And the reason this is not the case, well, there's probably about 800 reasons, but I'll mention 4 that I run into the most often. The first is that a lot of content projects are very project-oriented. So they're very focused on solving one single problem. We have too many images, so let's get a dam so that we can better work with agencies. Or we need to write more consistent product descriptions, so let's get a product information management system. So as a result of this departmental or task orientation, a lot of content management solutions are built basically without much awareness of the larger business ecosystem. And they're also often built and operated a bit independently from other more data-driven information management initiatives. So again, there's that business IT data versus content divide that gets perpetuated through this project focus. Another big issue is what I like to call the snowflake mentality, and I run into this a lot. So anytime you try to bring up the idea of a standard format or a structure, there is inevitably an outcry about how, oh my God, we can't reuse that content. It doesn't quite fit our purpose, or I can't tag my content with that data. It's all wrong. So they don't want IT or architects butting into their affairs, and they don't want to be told that they have to integrate with this or that other project or initiative that's going on. Everything is very custom. And you know, to be fair, sometimes they're right. Sometimes there are custom requirements or custom perspectives that need to be accommodated. But sometimes it's just a matter of readiness and understanding, which is the next point here, which is that not all parts of the business are at the same level of maturity in their understanding of what makes good data management and what is the value of enterprise consistency. Other groups, however, are chomping at the bit to be included into whatever is standard so that they don't have to do as much maintenance in their own systems. They just want to be plugged into what is everybody else doing, that's fine for me. And then sometimes it's just a matter of basic timing. You know, you start a project, you find out that there's another project going on that has a similar objective, and you say, oh, well, your metadata initiative is not going to be ready until July. Well, we need to launch in February, so I guess we'll catch you in phase 2 years from now. So that's, you know, it feels a little bit depressing when you find that out. But the last point is, because all these repositories keep popping up, it eventually becomes more and more difficult to solve the content problem without having to touch 6 different systems or applications. People's work processes bring them to multiple places, and it becomes extremely hard to keep up with what's good and what's active versus what's old. And then when you have mergers, that also hugely messes up content management. I'm working with a company right now that is trying to implement a digital asset management system, and we'd like to connect it up to their enterprise resource planning system, their ERP, to get product data automatically, except that there's 7 different ERPs because they've had about 30 brand mergers and purchases over the last 3 years. So imagine trying to pull some sort of clean product metadata from all 7 of those. So just to give you another example of how this typically will happen, here's a project that I worked on recently with a medical manufacturer. So this was a global website project. They wanted to create a single content management system that would contain all of their web product information and understand which products were available in which countries and really control what was being said about each product. So we would have all these controlled content elements so that every time we talked about a particular medical technique or a medical feature, it would be exactly the same across all of the websites, and it would be legally verified and cover any sort of regulatory risk. So I was hired for this large CMS project, except what they didn't consider is that they had actually already hired me a year ago. A whole other department of the organization had hired me to build something actually kind of similar for a digital asset management project. So they wanted a centralized system to put all of their photos and images and videos of all of their products. So I had already created a product structure for that and started tackling some of the same problems. So you can see already how these very project-focused, isolated initiatives were not really talking to each other. So when we did the dam, we had no idea that they had this new global website project in the works. So we created project structures or product structures from scratch because the content from the finance systems were too ugly to use. But now that we're doing this CMS, well, maybe we need to also think about the product catalog, the print, and all the other different places that we need product content and metadata, because maybe all of that should be centrally managed. And so what ended up happening in this case is they actually had to pause the enterprise CMS and website project in order to build this centralized product information management hub, essentially. So they lost about 1.5 to 2 years on this new fancy website. So essentially what we really needed in this case was, again, that enterprise view of the product ecosystem, a single place where we could take enterprise level, agreed upon data structures, terminology, and content, and then sort of pipe that through the different parts of the business. So if you look at on the left-hand side here, we have our enterprise resource planning, maybe it's product development database, it could be anything where we've got the core trusted information about our products. Well, some of that becomes product metadata for other systems. And some of that product metadata requires taxonomies, and maybe there's multiple of them, but if we're going to have a taxonomy, we'd love to be consistent across the various applications and in our content. So whether that's our customer-facing website, where we list all of our products and their specifications, or whether that's internally in our own intranet in SharePoint, where we share our product development documents. So we want to try to be as consistent as we can across all of these different channels. So what I'm really driving at is a basic philosophy that is, often sorely lacking on the business side. And I think, a lot of us who come from the metadata world understand this, but it becomes hard to communicate this to business managers. So if we think about it as content being an asset, businesses now have this new imperative to build and deliver content strategically. And not only because there's a lot of it, and not only because there's, unsustainable and scalability issues, but more importantly, because we need that larger understanding of content across the organization in order to do things like sophisticated knowledge work, where we're accessing lots of different applications in our work. We need to be more system and channel agnostic in the way that we present content to consumers. And we have to allow people to be able to cross that border between data and content when they need it for decision making. And then, of course, important to more the IT side of the house is being able to control for quality and consistency when we are presenting data, both internally and externally. So if we think about this idea, and I have to admit, ECA is not really a thing yet, Enterprise Content Architecture, but I'm kind of hoping it's going to be a thing. So I'm enlisting all of you on the phone to become proponents of ECA. And, I guess maybe I'm just jealous of all the other architectures that there are out there, data architecture and enterprise architecture. I'd like to have one more for us content people, so enterprise content architecture. And what we mean by that is an enterprise-wide approach to structuring, organizing, and harmonizing content resources so that they can be delivered effectively. If I break that down a little bit, structure, obviously that can mean metadata. It can also mean componentizing content, so breaking content down into smaller chunks to increase its use and to leverage that metadata to push smaller content chunks into the right spot in a given content experience. Organize them obviously means present them in a way that makes sense with the way people think, their business processes, use language that makes sense for them, use structures that make sense for them. The harmonize part, however, that's a little bit of a tougher one because that means having consistency not only across your structures but across the content itself. So that's consistent messages, consistent structure, and it also means harmony across systems, making content be able to move across systems in a fluid way. So if we kind of figure out where this fits into in the larger enterprise, it kind of has a lot of overlap with web content architecture, which you may already be familiar with. So this is, stuff like wireframing and things like that, where we're creating and structuring web content so that it can be delivered in a more seamless way, et cetera, et cetera. And this is usually quite customer facing. Another part of this is content strategy. So figuring out what content do we want to put on the web and how do we want to craft that message and what do we want to push to which channel. And then another piece of that is the back-end component where we're figuring out how we're going to manage this in our system. So enterprise content architecture has a fairly big footprint in the web space. But what we want to do now is extrapolate that and say, like, this is really similar things, but applied at the enterprise level. So you take away the specific web focus and the marketing focus, but you think about all those other great things like content structure and content reuse and efficiency and planning, and you put that at the enterprise strategy level. And you take also the enterprise content management technology level. Now you're starting to think even more broadly, and you're starting to blend in all those concepts. And then ultimately this overlaps with something that already exists, which is more classically on the IT side of the house, which is enterprise information management, which is basically a very high-level integrative discipline for structuring, describing, and governing information regardless of technology or organizational boundaries. So it's really a high level, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't touch on that content architecture component of it, where you're saying rather than just individual rows of data in a database or full documents, I want to think of content as this one paragraph or this one little item or this one spec having to do with this overall product or this overall concept. So it's very similar, but on that left-hand side, the information management, there seems to be a little bit more of a document or a data focus, whereas what I'm talking about is really common frameworks that touch all of the different pieces. So we're talking about creating a common architectural element that can span content and data systems and providing that integrated framework to allow content to flow across all of the systems. Now, unfortunately, what happens a lot in the industry that I see a lot in organizations that people try to solve this kind of problem with federated search. And while I totally appreciate federated search and I love federated search, it is not the same as managing content. So as organizations start to move more towards service-oriented architecture, which is, having a service that you can call and having systems being able to pull content from this common service, not worry about what system it comes from, it's become even clearer that the management of unstructured information, not just retrieval of it, is needed to have the kind of information integrity that we're looking for. So we're looking for normalization of metadata and data both together using common architecture and frameworks, such as taxonomy, metadata, and of course search. So I'm going to take 1 minute and I'm just going to lay out some definitions before I get too far down the road, just in case some of you are from the data side or more of you from the metadata side, just so that we all have the same terminology here. When I say enterprise data, I'm really talking about what's known as master data or reference data. So this is core data that's essential to business operations and that's agreed upon and shared across the business. And this is, honestly, the first thing that most organizations get under control, and it's typically pretty rigorously managed, depending again on the size of the organization or the size of the IT department. Enterprise metadata, in this case, is metadata that is also agreed upon and shared, along with the semantic definitions of what those metadata elements mean in various systems and how they relate back to each other. So it's essentially like a big legend for metadata across systems. And of course, some enterprise data can be used as enterprise metadata. Enterprise taxonomy is shared vocabulary across the organization, or in the case of metadata, an understanding of where there are differences and mappings between them. And then here, of course, some enterprise metadata uses enterprise taxonomy, and some enterprise taxonomy is actually enterprise data to some degree. This will make more sense later. And then finally, when I say enterprise content, it's actual content objects themselves at any level. So whether that's a full document or even just a small component of content, and that is shared across the organization. So let's talk now a little bit about what it's like to try to do this kind of enterprise content architecture or harmonization in the enterprise context. Because, it's quite a crunchy problem to solve. So I'll start with one of my favorite projects that I've ever done, which was with a greeting card manufacturer. So obviously we've all moved towards a lot more digital content, and this has really changed the greeting card creative process. So they used to actually hire artists to paint things and to make art, and then they would take pictures of it and put that on the cover of card. And now, of course, it's all Photoshop and things like that, and it's a lot more digital art. So this project was, let's implement a new digital asset management system so that we can manage all of our art for our cards, and then not only that, but be able to reuse a lot more of it. So if I create a picture of a cake, if I color that cake white, it's a wedding cake. If I color it pink, maybe it's a princess birthday cake. So I can reuse that same birthday cake image multiple times. And of course, we want to make it easier to search assets and increase that reuse for all of our internal departments who are involved in the creative process. What was cool about this project, though, is that it wasn't just about digital asset management. So early on in their project, they had that enterprise content architecture realization, and they said, well, if we're going to be re-architecting the way that we manage assets, we should also think about how we manage products, because our assets essentially go on products, and there's all these connections between those systems and those processes, as well as licensing and workflow and all these things. And then, of course, if you go forward the other direction, there's all these desktop tools that we use to actually create the art. So it would make so much more sense if we started applying metadata much earlier in the process. And they went even further than that in the end. So we went all the way back into the process to say, right when we think of a new card idea, so they have this process at the beginning of each year where they decide how many cards they're going to create for which occasions and what kind of cards they're going to be. So through that whole planning and conception phase, what if we started our metadata way up there? So some of the major questions that we had to think about doing this from an enterprise content architecture perspective was, well, when we look at all of those steps in the process, where are those major content or data heavy steps? Where are we creating most of our intelligence? And what systems are involved? And when there are systems involved, what kind of data and content are they creating, and which one, when they overlap, should be the system of record for a particular idea? And then how can we repurpose content and metadata from one step of the process to the other so that when we get to the end of the line, we don't end up with a card that has the wrong glitter color on it or has a typo, let's say. So when we did the analysis, we looked through their current state, and they actually had 8 different systems involved in just the concept and create steps of the process. So this is before they physically make anything, just the planning stage. And the creation stage as the mock-ups. And here you can see all of the different metadata that was considered important and originated in the various systems, and some of them are not connected to other systems, and some of them have very tight connections, so it was quite the mess. And there was a lot of metadata going on in all of those different systems, and they had, in one case, you'd think a greeting card company occasion would be a fairly straightforward thing. You know, there's birthdays, there's anniversaries, there's graduations, but there was actually 17 different lists of occasions across the various systems and across the various departments. So we had to start consolidating all of those different ways of talking about the same thing. And what was also difficult about this is that if you look at the one furthest to the right here, it says anniversary general 40th, anniversary general belated. They actually merged a lot of different concepts in different versions of this occasion list. So in this one you can see anniversary general feminine. So really that's an occasion and a gender. Or anniversary general from both. And this is really an occasion merged with the sender of the card. So they had a lot of data integrity issues. So they had a hard time reporting on how many feminine focused cards did we make, or how many did we make that were from mom. So what we were really aiming towards is getting a common layer of enterprise metadata and taxonomy going through all of those steps and eventually forward into the manufacturing area. So manufacturing was not part of the scope of this particular project, but it was the next big project that they had on their plate, and they had full intentions of continuing the enterprise metadata and taxonomy into that portion. So even though we were not involving manufacturing in some of the design work that we were doing, we were involving them as a reviewer on a lot of those things so that we wouldn't build anything that would conflict with what they were doing. And we actually took some input from them, from some of their systems, so that we could make sure we were taking it into consideration. So we were really treating this taxonomy and metadata as a unifier across all these different applications. So we had some systems like the product database consuming some vocabularies. Others, like the manufacturing, would be providing the source of record for a particular vocabulary, such as fold type here. And then a lot of them are very shared. So what we ended up with was a fairly extensive taxonomy framework that split up the different attributes and associated vocabularies into different spheres, some of which were shared across the entire organization. So something like occasion or tone or licensing related metadata was very much shared and had to be agreed on by everybody. But art style was really only cared about by the art department, so we had a lot less negotiation and validation to do for some of the other vocabularies. And this is an exciting type of project as the taxonomy and metadata specialist, because we're kind of starting from scratch. So I can build a beautiful enterprise taxonomy and metadata however I want, and we're replacing about 4 different systems at once. So I can feed that same enterprise taxonomy into all of those systems, which then gives us the ability to do beautiful business intelligence without having to transform everything. Which is the promise of enterprise taxonomy and metadata. Wouldn't it be all so great if we all spoke the same language and we all shared a Coke together? But you know, in reality, it doesn't often work out that way, and it's more like the UN, where we have a bunch of different languages being spoken, and we all kind of need to translate across each other. So the other way that I often work in these projects is using the taxonomy as a translator. So we have lots of different systems going on, lots of different legacy systems or current systems that have very different ways of talking. And so we use the enterprise metadata and taxonomy to basically create that translation layer or map between all of the versions of the thing. And this is very common in the metadata world. We all do crosswalks. This is basically a really giant crosswalk across lots of different vocabularies and lots of different fields, which then is leveraged by some of those common framework elements like business intelligence, enterprise search, so on and so forth. One of the projects that I had to do this recently for was a volunteer management agency. So this is an organization that sends volunteers different parts of the globe to work on sanitation projects or work with elections, those kinds of things. And their idea was we would very much like to revamp our volunteer management data collection and content management so that we can conform to some of the UN data standards that are going on right now. And not only that, but some of the external open data initiatives. So there's a lot of transparency initiatives going around right now with United Nations related type organizations, while still improving our own internal reporting capabilities. So they started this project, let's look across all of our systems and let's develop enterprise metadata and taxonomies. And some of the things we were interested in standardizing were development topics. So this is what kind of volunteer project was it? Was it having to do with human rights? Was it having to do with elections? Was it having to do with environment and sustainability? What kind of result were we expecting from this development project? What kind of activity was being done on this development project? Was it IT support? Was it manual labor? So on and so forth. And then, of course, countries and organizations that were involved in the project. Now, unfortunately, as you know, there's typically not only one standard for anything. So there was often at least 3 or 4 standards that we could follow for any given metadata element. And so you had to sort of choose, well, do we follow the UN core standard? Do we follow some other worldwide organization standard? Or do we follow the Transparency Initiative standards for some of these key elements? The other thing that was a big challenge was also this organization was a subsidiary of a larger parent organization, and the larger parent organization was actually way behind in their own metadata and taxonomy work. And so we had nothing to reuse from them. And they were saying, well, we'll get to it in a year maybe or 2. And we're like, well, we need to move forward. So we essentially created our own disconnect between the subsidiary and the parent. The other issue is that they had about 50 years of old data that was required to continue doing reporting that would include all of their historical content. So we couldn't just do a lock stock replacement of metadata and taxonomy. We had to maintain all the links to the old versions of things. And of course, they also have systems that they personally don't manage. They use some of the parent organization systems, so even if they wanted to change things, they couldn't. So this is a case where we very much had to rely on this style of taxonomy and metadata, where we created a centralized hub, that pink part, where we said, here are all the new ways we want to start talking about these things and the new metadata that we want to capture in the systems that we control, but we need to understand how this relates back to the metadata in the systems that we don't control and be able to pull that into common reporting. Another organization that I worked with recently is a media company. So this is a company that makes TV shows, and they had lots of different systems. They had a digital asset management system for all of their artwork, so the pictures of all their characters. They had a SharePoint install for all their sales documents and things like that, and then they had a completely separate episode database for the videos themselves. And their IT department was super gung-ho about this idea of creating this huge enterprise ontology, where they would create this large metadata taxonomy model that would connect everything, and they could know exactly how much money SpongeBob made in a given year across any content, any channel, any system. Except that that project had been, in planning, quote unquote, for about 6 years. By the time we started, we were actually working on the artwork and the federated search project. So we said, well, that's great that you have this long-term dream project of creating this enterprise ontology, but we need something a little bit more practical right now. So let's take our common taxonomy that we're going to build for this artwork, let's talk to the episode people, and let's talk to the SharePoint people, and let's talk to whoever we need to talk to start some of these common structures and frameworks. Let's have the same list of characters, let's have the same episode titles, let's have some of the same terminology, so that when we do a federated search across all of these applications, that we get meaningful content. So what we're really driving towards here is 3 layers of metadata. There's clearly still a case where I'm building an application, I'm managing digital assets as an example, and only I care about image position. There is no other system unless it's also managing digital assets, and if we have two systems managing digital assets, then we have a different problem. But no other system probably cares about image position. Or if I'm in the art department at that greeting card manufacturer, art style is pretty much only relevant to that one application or that one department. Then the next layer down is domain-specific metadata, or things that are shared across multiple applications, but not necessarily the entire company. So in the greeting card example, maybe some of the art facets are relevant across the entire art department, and it's relevant in the planning database, but it's also relevant in the art database. And we need to get some sort of agreement on those. But then there's this last layer of core enterprise metadata and taxonomy, where we say this is applicable to all enterprise content. And anytime you start a new IT project or spool up a new content management system or a new data project, you need to consult this core enterprise metadata framework. And if you're using any of the elements in that, you need to conform to our standard, or at least try to explain to us why you can't, and then we maintain the harmonized mapping between what you're doing and what we're doing. So seen a different way, you've got level 1 metadata, which is core attributes. We require it on everything. We've got central control that is multifunctional, more committee style. Level 2 is those secondary attributes, which are common across some of the systems. And then level 3, which is still allowed, is system-specific stuff. But again, if you think back to what I said earlier about the snowflake mentality, we want to make sure that people are making things unique because they actually are unique and not because they think it's unique. So here's an example of a project I'm working on right now with a food manufacturer, where we're working on a digital asset management project, also a recipe database, which is connected back up to their product information management system. So we've started an enterprise initiative as part of this project to say, we'd like to, as an organization, say that brand, product type, division, and flavor is required on all things or product that have to do with product, all content that has to do with products. On a level 2, we're working on this recipe database, and there's multiple recipe-oriented processes and systems in this particular organization. There's a print part, there's the recipe management, there's collaboration stuff with the kitchens. And so for that, we do want to share some things. So we share the level 1 and what's in level 2, such as the occasion that a recipe might be for, or the season that a recipe might be relevant in due to ingredients. But then there's a couple of things that are relevant only to the specific recipe database, which is what is the prep time of this recipe and what's the number of ingredients. So this is a great example of where we took a project which was theoretically a very project-focused or task-focused project, so we care about digital assets. But we said, you know what, let's not just care about digital assets, let's blow this up and go a couple of layers above, and let's worry about the product database and let's worry about the recipe database, because there are linkages in all these things, there are business processes tying all these things, and we want to make sure that there is good data and content governance across all of these systems. And that's how it often happens. So some of the different reasons that an enterprise content architecture project can get spooled up is often IT has some sort of data governance initiative that they're starting, so they're looking at their own master data, and it kind of gets expanded to include business metadata or taxonomies that are more business focused. So that's one way that you can get these things started. Another one is where it more often happens in my case, where we're doing a business process focused project that actually starts caring about integration with either upstream or downstream systems. So we're forced to think about the larger ecosystem. And then that usually incites people to think more about data governance and to think more about, well, if we're doing it for these 3 systems or 2 systems, why don't we include this other one or this other one? And then it soon becomes kind of an enterprise level project. And then last but not least, and this is a little bit more rare, but more and more these days, I'm getting a lot more clients that are savvy about taxonomy and metadata and consider it a strategic priority. And so they start this enterprise level initiative about data quality and content management that addresses metadata and taxonomies. So when we do these projects, what usually ends up happening is we get the mandate to look at taxonomy and metadata from the enterprise perspective. So the first thing we do is start establishing, well, okay, what is going to be that core metadata? What are we going to consider that level 1 stuff? And then once we understand what our scope is, or what we're considering enterprise taxonomy and metadata for this particular project, then we start collecting cross-functional requirements. So talking to legal, talking to marketing, talking to manufacturing, talking to all the different parts of the business that may need a say in what we're building. Once we've got the lay of the land, we build a taxonomy or metadata framework. And then the fun thing is you have to actually implement it in something. So even though it's an enterprise structure, doesn't mean you can apply it across the whole enterprise simultaneously. So we end up implementing the enterprise things in a specific focused tool or project, such as a digital asset management system or a content management system. And then we start building the governance, which will help it then loop back and start implementing in the other systems. So it can be a very iterative process. But looking at this first step of establishing core metadata and taxonomy, so some of the kinds of things that we're thinking about here is, what kind of metadata do we really care about to the enterprise level? So where do we want to have additional control? One of the projects I worked on, or I'm working on right now actually, has to do with product category names. So even though you'd think a product category name would not be that complicated, the testing department in this organization calls it a certain way because they're all engineers, and then the website people who care about SEO want to call it something completely different, and then the way they structure their taxonomies is completely different. And so there is a need for that to be better controlled so that this company can do better business intelligence and planning over the year. Anything that has a high cross-system or cross-process application is also something that can be considered core metadata. Anywhere where you need additional governance, anywhere where there's standards that you need to follow, anywhere that something represents a really core access point or information need for search, navigation, or reporting. So thinking back to that greeting card manufacturer, occasion was just such a core idea, it became completely impossible to think that we could have different lists of occasions once we started the project. It became this thing that the managers would hang their hat on to say, we need to look at everything by occasion. Everything, whether it's finance, whether it's card planning, whether it's art, output, it's all occasion-based. So we cannot afford, as an organization, to speak different languages on this. Once you've thought through all those questions, then you're starting to build your inventory. And so I spend a lot of time collecting data models from lots of different applications. I make friends with all the data architects at the companies that I'm working at, pull any controlled vocabularies that they already have. I often have to look at business process models and workflow documents, and I end up building these really giant inventories. So this is just one small sample of this greeting card company inventory where I've got two different versions of the inventory. I've got a concept-oriented view where, regardless of what system it's from or what it might be called in a particular system, what is this referring to? So, a couple of lines down in that first table, I have something called line in C93. What that actually means, brand. Creative card size versus card size code. So these things all mean the same thing. So I do it both concept oriented, and then I'm able to also flip it by system if I want to see which fields are coming from which system. And then at some point in that inventory, I start identifying which ones are the system of record for a particular concept. So I might have 5 different systems that deal with brand or logo, but only one of them defines the brand or the logo. or ideally one of them should define. And maybe none of them define it. Maybe it gets defined outside of a specific system and it's part of a business process. I often create these very scary concept diagrams that some people love and some people are totally terrified by. So this is all of the different concept-oriented elements that are connected to a particular product and then connected to each concept. So if we look here at the top, I've got occasion linked to product. Here are all the different metadata fields that relate back to the concept of occasion. And you can really get a sense here of the variety and different types of terminology that are being used across the organization. Of course, the data people find that totally scary. They much prefer entity relationship diagrams and things being very clear. Content strategists are the opposite. They're very fluffy and ambiguous, and they use pictures and not a lot of detail. So I try to go somewhere in between those two worlds to bridge that gap between, again, the content marketing world and the IT world. In the end, we end up doing a lot of negotiation with all these different groups. So everyone has a different perspective. Again, we have those different timelines. So my thing needs to launch in 6 months. We are not going to think about this for 2 more years. Don't bother me. Different terminology. Some people have been working in the organization for 60+ years. Different workflows between groups. So we end up having to talk to lots of different types of stakeholders and getting very different kind of input. And I'll walk you through a fun example, and I mean fun very literally, if it's funny. This was with the greeting card group again, where you think the concept of something being funny. So how do we know which cards are funny? Which cards are we intending to be funny? Which ones do our clients think are funny? This has a lot of different layers. So from the planning perspective, the idea of funny is very basic. Okay, we need a humorous card. And we need 88 humorous designs to fill in the display at the card store and make sure that we have enough of the funny variant to fulfill demand. And we want funny cards of lots of different card styles. So we want some traditional funny ones, we want some more juvenile funny ones, and we want some more hipster style funny ones. When that gets translated over to the editorial department, they're like, well, what do you mean? Funny. I can't just say funny. Well, you have to tell me specifically what kind of funny you want. I need to know if it's absurd funny. Is it toilet funny? Is it light, silly funny? So there's a lot of different layers to the concept of funny in the editorial department. But then when it goes on the website, nobody would ever navigate or search by light, sarcastic card or dark toilet, all these different combinations. They are only trying to see what's going to make me laugh. So there's a lot of different perspectives on a single concept. And in this case, a different tool might need a different subset of things or a different granularity level. So over on the planning side, I know for this year, I'm going to need 3 new bow designs and 4 ribbon designs. But by the time I get to manufacturing, I need to know exactly what type of ribbon that's going to be, what color, what type of fabric. So there's a lot of different layers going on through the process. The other really important point that I wanted to bring up is this idea that metadata and master data can be completely separate initiatives, and never the twain shall meet, and the content people can go do their thing with their metadata and the data people can go do their thing with their metadata. But ultimately, a lot of master data ends up being reused in my projects as metadata on unstructured content. So I have these big product management systems or enterprise resource planning systems, and I need to grab some of that content and pump it directly into my content system so that I don't need to maintain stuff all the time. So if I've already got a list of product categories going on in my ERP, I'd love to be able to just pump that over into the digital asset management system and have one less thing to manage. Not only that, I'm making my life easier from an integration perspective and also from a reporting perspective. However, as we just talked about, it's not always easy to talk the same language, so we often have cases where we have existing taxonomies that are very deeply embedded in the organization, such as financial taxonomies. Here's an example of one for a grocery store. So they have this very strange looking, it's actually a 5-level deep structure with lots of abbreviations and acronyms because they have character limits in that particular system. And there's no way I could use this for the e-commerce of the grocery website. So I need to translate that between the chicken fish split breast sum into, you know, frozen or fresh chicken breasts in a way that a user could actually navigate on the website. However, I still need to be able to tie that back to the financial taxonomy. So I need to create that mapping or link between the financial and the customer taxonomy. All of this brings me to a thing that I'm seeing much more in enterprise level projects these days, and that's service-oriented architecture. And taxonomy and metadata have a huge role to play in the service-oriented architecture. So this is what it looks like right now. We have this concept of a product category, and I have what's considered the master over in the ERP, but that's this ugly 3-level deep structure that has different names that I want to use. And so I do a transformation on that to be able to use it in e-commerce. And then it also has to go into the CMS, and then the CMS needs to transform it so that we can use it in BI, and so on and so forth. So it becomes really hard to know, however, which one of these systems is the best place to keep the correct version or the source of record. And so we end up looking through all the different options, and some of the content systems are really bad at handling things like hierarchy. So if you tried to do SharePoint before 2013, you probably would have been very upset because SharePoint metadata had no concept of hierarchical taxonomy, and so you couldn't even build a taxonomy if you wanted to. Some systems have no taxonomy management functionality at all. Some systems have a really hard time importing or exporting content or values for metadata and taxonomy from one system to another. So what we're really trying to move forward and towards is having a single location outside of any particular content or data system to manage these kinds of metadata and taxonomy elements and manage those changes and track relationships. So I end up doing a lot of projects where we're talking and looking at taxonomy management tools. This is just one example. I'm not pushing this particular one. There's about 5 or 6 very popular taxonomy management tools, and I can provide a list to anyone who's interested in looking into them. But what we use these tools for, and you can even build your own if you're so inclined. You can spool up a nice little database, a relational database, or a triple store if you're ontology people. And this is a little bit of a scary diagram, but essentially, if you look in the middle here, you've got a service-oriented architecture where we're going to provide taxonomy as a service. So any system can call the taxonomy through an API and pull whatever subset of the taxonomy, whatever level of granularity. We can have different versions of the label, and it can pull only the component of it that it needs for its particular purpose. So in here, I've got my taxonomy feeding the digital asset management, it's feeding reporting, it's feeding the search server, it's feeding lots of different applications. But it's also maintaining all the relationships between the different subsets and labeling versions that these different systems need. So even though I might need to call my washing machine a washer in one context or another, the taxonomy knows that all of those things are the same thing and links it back to a common identifier. Here's another one. This is a project I'm working on right now with an automotive manufacturer, so that they are trying to get their product information management under control. So they have a whole product management suite of tools happening in the R&D side of the house, which is on the left here. There they do their vision and strategy, and then they have SAP, and they have all sorts of things going on that product development side. And then once the product is developed, they pump a bunch of information over to the content side of the house, who are going to do the product catalogs and the dealer websites and the regular customer websites and all the print collateral. And they have a marketing product information management system. And now in order to make sure that every time they talk about this particular vehicle color, that even though it might be called black number 3572 in the product R&D database, that when it goes to the website, it's called Awesome Avenger Black every time, and it's spelled the same time, and it's explained the same time in every channel that is customer facing. So these tend to be really exciting projects because the taxonomy and metadata become not just a side tool that are meant to show up somewhere in an interface or to help findability in that tool, but it really becomes this enterprise-wide imperative to get our act together, clean our stuff up, to have better reporting, to better understand what it is that we're doing as an organization. So wrapping it up, what I hope you got from this, some of the key points, is that even though you might be part of a very focused project, so building a publication database or a website or whatever, it is always a great idea to step back and to look at that larger enterprise context and figure out, how can I create the architecture in my system, both from a data, metadata, and content level, in a way that allows me to connect back to any other processes or systems that may be hooked up to in the future my system or my project. The other point is that even though IT and content people tend to work in different parts of the organization and perhaps not intermingle that much, there's a huge amount of value in bringing those two groups together. First of all, to help IT understand the value of content and applying the same kind of rigor to content that we do to master data, but also to help the business understand why governance and data quality is so important, even when it comes to something as ephemeral and quickly changing as marketing content. The third is to reuse enterprise data where you can. So even though it may not be the most beautiful data, there's always a way that you can take existing lists, existing structures, existing architectures and apply them elsewhere so that you can make it easier to integrate across systems. And then the last point, which is what happens to me 99% of the time, even if there's resistance at first, you should still go ahead and make something enterprise level where you can, because if you consider the enterprise and talk to a wider array of stakeholders and say, I'm building this list of colors, or I'm building a product category architecture, I'd like your input, it will get around, and eventually they will come back to you and say, hey, I heard you're building this thing, we'd love to tap into that, and then you end up moving more towards that service-oriented approach to metadata and taxonomy. I hope that was enlightening, at least in terms of the enterprise perspective, and I'll turn it back to Stuart to take any questions at this point.
Thank you, Stephanie. If you have questions, you'll notice that there is a box for you to enter your questions, and I have one right now. It says, how do you use Dublin Core in your projects? Could you comment on use of other standards such as AL2, SCOS, FOF, Good Relations, QUDT, etc.?
What a great question. So the Dublin Core is actually an interesting thing because a lot of the times I'm doing very internal focused projects and there's not a lot of appetite for some of those external standards when there's not a requirement to integrate with other external sources. So when it's very internal, it's very focused on our product information, we're not exchanging anything with anyone, then we tend to focus less on standards. Anytime there is a larger context of integration, such as product management for a company such as I'm doing a project with Consumer Reports right now, and so they want to take in and exchange information with Amazon, with Sears, with Home Depot, with a lot of different organizations. And so in that case, we are very focused on existing product standards, and we are using Good Relations, and we're using SCOS, and we're trying to figure out whether any of these large retailers are using things like the UNSPUC and some of the other product-oriented standards, in which case that gives us a great excuse to say, this is now our new enterprise standard, we are all going to follow this, there are no more fiefdoms within the enterprise, this is the way. So I'd love for it to be an obvious go-to in all of my projects, but sometimes it can be a little bit of a hard sell if there's no immediate use case for exchanging data with another organization. As far as OWL and SCOS, that is something that is also increasing much more. I used to have to explain what a taxonomy was 4 years ago in order to get buy-in for projects. Now people are starting to come to me and say, hey, we heard about this ontology thing, we are interested in it, and we are starting to do things by default in SCOS and moving towards OWL as well for a lot of some of these taxonomies and metadata structures. So it's slow for the average company who is just getting their arms around taxonomy, but it's getting there.
Thank you. Here's another question from Joseph Bush. Can you talk more about the challenges of using taxonomy as a translator in a federated search context? Of course, it would be better to have a clean architecture. Practically, don't we need to integrate with pre-existing repositories?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a great question. Thank you, Joseph. I almost never get to do these projects where you build a beautiful taxonomy and it gets applied into 6 different systems. It is practically almost always this larger, more complex translation approach, which always makes it a lot harder to do things like federated search. So you end up having to do a lot more sophisticated integrations between whatever you're using for taxonomy management or metadata management and the search tool itself. So you end up having to tell the search engine what a lot of these things mean and then do a consolidated version for whatever you're going to do in the UI. So if you think that, let's say you're working in a context where you have product categories and you have 5 different product categories from these different consuming systems, and you want to create a common search UI across all of those things, well, you have to come up with a single version to show in the UI as a filter, perhaps. Or maybe you're going to let the people, once they've run their search, to pick a particular application and see only that version of the taxonomy. But we often end up spending a solid month of time in a given project. So my usual taxonomy projects run 3 to 4 months. We'll usually spend one of those months doing a lot of cross-mapping between existing taxonomies. In the project I mentioned about the digital asset management and all those different ERPs, what we're doing is for the translated version that we're going to show in the digital asset management as that common interface, we're getting stakeholder buy-in and validation on that consolidated version from everyone, but you'll be able to see when you open up an asset, so you look at a picture, you'll be able to see all the different versions of the product category from the original ERP if you need to be able to see that. So there's a lot of different mitigation styles that you can use.
How do you advise companies on taxonomy governance across different departments and divisions?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm actually building a governance structure right now for one of my clients, and I'm going to be honest with you. I used to be very much, let's make a really big committee and involve people from all the different departments, and it'll be so great and cross-functional, and everyone will have a say. And I tried that a number of times, and it ended up failing pretty hard. Not because people don't want to work together, but because people are just really busy, and there's varying levels of caring about things like metadata and taxonomy. And while when you're doing a taxonomy development project, people get into it and participate, when the project is done, they're usually a lot less interested in ongoing management. So what I tend to do is build a much smaller core team where I pull in representatives that have a little bit of a wider purview or perspective. So I'll pull in someone from the overall marketing, or I'll pull in someone from the overall data governance side at a little bit higher level of the organization, and I build more of a strategic governance team that cares about the overall structure and application of the taxonomy. So they care about the strategic parts of the taxonomy, about how is this going to be used? Which systems is it going to go into? If we need to make major changes to it, how do we do that? So that's the level of decision making that happens in there. And then I build a separate team, which is much more focused on the day-to-day maintenance of the taxonomies themselves. And then this tends to be a little bit larger and include more representatives, but the representatives are focused on one or more smaller parts of the taxonomy and not the whole thing. And we have a taxonomy management role, whether that's a full-time role or not, depends on the organization, who is basically acting like dispatcher. And so instead of getting 17 people together for a meeting whenever we want to change the name of a product category, this taxonomy management person says, all right, we need to change the product category. Who is going to care about that? Let me ping them, see what they think. If it's fine, we'll just go ahead without a meeting. If it's not fine, we'll have the meeting and we'll invite the people who are identified as being relevant to that process. So it can be a larger group of people in theory, but in practice, you can't involve 17 people every time you need to make a decision. So there has to be a very strong gatekeeping from that taxonomy management lead person. So that's been my new approach to doing it, is to separate the strategic part of the taxonomy, so the architecture part, from the day-to-day maintenance, and to try to shield the average subject matter expert from as much of it as possible and really only pull them in when they've been identified as caring strongly about something.
Another question. Who are the proponents of metadata taxonomy, and what will be your advice to a layman who wants to be well-versed in metadata and taxonomy?
I'm not sure I understood the proponents part. What are the proponents of the...
I'm assuming that probably means who are the advocates, who are the, who are...
Oh, I see, within the organization.
That would be great.
Yeah. So I think within the organization, the people that I end up making as allies are, well, again, it depends on the organization, but I often will make very good friends with enterprise architects who are big nerds. They love data structure, they love control, they love standardization, and so they tend to be very keen on becoming part of these things. I also become very good friends with anyone who's in an analytics role. So business intelligence, reporting, and analytics are also huge adopters of this. The new part that has happened in the last, I would say, 3 years is that the content managers and content publishing department, so editorial, marketing, those kinds of groups, they used to really not care and think of taxonomy and metadata as a nuisance, like, oh, really, I have to tag? You're going to force me to use these keywords? How terrible of you. They are now getting much more on board with the whole idea of dynamic content publishing, whereby you use metadata and taxonomy to drive an entire website. So if you look at the stuff the BBC is doing or any of those really large platforms, all of that is all metadata and taxonomy driven, and they're getting really excited by that. So I'm getting much more good support from those people, and those people are not well versed at all in metadata and taxonomy when we start these projects. So there's a lot of education that happens, a lot of sort of tackling the idea of what is metadata, how is it helpful in content management, what does taxonomy mean, and now even more we're going into ontology. So how can I leverage taxonomy and ontology relationships to make my content smarter and more dynamic in the way that it is displayed? And I'm starting to get a lot more stronger relationships with the people in those kinds of roles as well.
Here is another question. What if your organization does not use metadata management or has no managed data models? Is it realistic to still build a taxonomy in this case? What would be the issues?
I think it absolutely is still realistic to build a taxonomy. I have built lots of taxonomies that live in Excel spreadsheets, and that is the extent of it. So even without a fancy metadata repository or service-oriented architecture, any of that cool IT stuff, there's definitely lots of opportunities to build and manage taxonomies and apply them. One of the organizations I worked for briefly as an employee, we actually built our own taxonomy tool. It was just a really simple Oracle database. It was not that complicated. We managed all of our different labels. We were using that to do dynamic content presentation on the website and internal content management. So we were pumping it out to 3 different systems, and all it really needed to do was be able to import and export data. So it really was not that complex to set up. But even in a spreadsheet, I've been able to use taxonomies as kind of a fancy editorial guideline to some extent, where it lives in a spreadsheet and you share it and you say, all right, well, folks in the IT department, I know we don't have a very sophisticated mechanism for this, but here is the agreed upon list of product categories and colors and, you know, volunteer activities that we would like to perpetuate across all of our systems. And every time we create a new system in the application or in the organization or create some sort of new UI, whatever the case may be, let's have as part of our governance process, our project initiation process, that the taxonomy or metadata responsible reviews whatever metadata you're going to make for that system and, you know, consults this list wherever it happens to live. So I don't think the technology is that big an obstacle. It's really more about whether you have someone championing it in the right spots in the business process. So if you've got someone who is involved in the project initiation phase of whatever project it is and can raise their hand and say, hey, we already have a taxonomy for this, or we already have a metadata standard that we should apply for this thing that you're building from scratch, then you're much further ahead than you were before.
Okay, one last question, and I think I'm going to ask it. Stephanie, very, very interesting presentation. But I have a question about your background. As a faculty member taught for many years in library and information science, you have a degree in basically library and information science, if I have it correctly. How did you make this leap? How do you make that leap into sufficient knowledge of enterprise to function?
What a fabulous question. You know what? I wish I could say that my library degree prepared me for this career. It kind of didn't. No offense to my alma mater. It was at the time in the middle of a transition from traditional library science to more of a knowledge management approach. And while I enjoyed knowledge management theoretically, it wasn't terribly practical, so I didn't learn how to make anything. I didn't learn how to build a collaboration system or anything like that. The extent of the technology component of my library degree was HTML. You learned how to make HTML, and you learned a little bit about library cataloging systems. So at the time, I took it upon myself to go over to the management faculty and take a couple courses in database design so that I would at least know how to speak SQL. And from there, I graduated. I went right into consulting, and it was very much a sink or swim situation. I was put into these large consulting projects where I was alongside these big teams of folks from Accenture, for example, and learned just a lot on the job about how does it work? How do you set up a content management system? What does enterprise architecture mean? What is master data management? What does a master data management system look like? How do these things work together? You can't really do that through book learning. It's really from being in an enterprise context and learning the ropes as you're doing these projects. So there's obviously a lot of content available on the web. You can Google stuff, you can read up. There's a lot of great things in Gartner, and IBM does a lot of great publishing on master data management and metadata management, but a lot of it is just figuring it out by doing it.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephanie. Well, thank you for again for a very exciting webinar, and thank you everyone who was present here today to listen. There were over 75 of you at the peak just before we went into Q&A. So it's my pleasure again to thank you, Stephanie, and turn this back over to Stefan for any announcements here at the end before we stop.
And also thank you to Devlin Core and to ASIST for inviting me. I very much appreciated the opportunity.
Alrighty, thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Stuart, for today's webinar. To those still in attendance, the webinar slides and recording of the webinar will be available for you within 48 hours of today's live broadcast, and it will be sent via follow-up email, so please keep an eye out for that. And if that is all, that is it for today. Have a great day, guys.